Welcome everyone. The webinar will begin at the top of the hour and will be recorded. Connect with the campaign for grade level reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. Please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learned from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. Once again, we would love to connect with you. So on Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. The webinar will begin shortly and it will be recorded and shared with you afterwards. Okay, once again, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sierra Sanchez and I will be behind the scenes helping to produce this webinar. I have just a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure when responding to select panelists and attendees in the chat box so that we all know who is here. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage your engagement by posting questions in the Q&A box. We will dedicate the last portion of the webinar to respond to the questions you post during the discussion. This webinar is being recorded and a link to the recording will be emailed to all who registered on Friday. And we will be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during the Q&A portion and highly encourage you to respond. This just helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Lastly, before we start, I would just like to call your attention to our upcoming GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars this month. Or next month rather. On April 6th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, we continue with our Learning Loss Recovery Challenge series with a session focusing on the importance of student assessments to inform differentiated instruction, a way of teaching that gives children the experiences and tasks that they need to improve learning. The following week on April 13th, we will have a double header. At 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, our Crucible of Practice session will highlight the work of Story County, Iowa. This GLR coalition will share the work that has helped transform the early childhood landscape in their community. At 3 p.m. Eastern Time, we launch a three-part series on the American Rescue Plan and how to ensure smart investments for systemic change. The first learning conversation on April 13th will center investments in K-3. Lastly, on April 20th, in our 12:30 Funder to Funder conversation, we will bring part 2 of the American Rescue Plan focused on reducing child poverty. And that same day at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, we will have part 3 of the American Rescue Plan and a session entitled 20 Billion for After School and Summer, Realizing the Opportunity for Communities. We'll be sure to add a link in the chat box for more information and registration for these upcoming learning opportunities. Joining you now is Yoli Flores, Chief Learning Officer for the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Sierra, and welcome to each and every one of you for joining us for today's GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar, Why Shattering the Wall Between Home and School is a Good Thing. This session is the first in a series co-sponsored by the Overdeck Family Foundation, where together we will bring to you a series of learning conversations this year that will help us advance early school success. Today's inaugural session with the Overdeck Family Foundation will center on a theme that has been in front of us and our work for a very long time. It's the essential role that parents play in their children's education, that important connection between home and school, parents and teachers. In this session, we will learn from social entrepreneurs and practitioners how this year, the year of COVID-19, has in fact given us a gift, a silver lining, if you will. The gift of finally realizing a simple truth, that parents are valuable and essential partners and co-producers of good outcomes for their children. Out of necessity, the pandemic helped shatter the wall between home and school and has paved the way for a deeper and more meaningful relationship between schools and homes that will benefit children and their educational outcomes. But it took intention and wisdom to create something new to replace those walls. Our panel today will share how they each stepped in to create a new reality in how schools and families engage, work together, and create better futures for students, and what it will take to maintain this new reality beyond a pandemic. So without further delay, I am pleased to introduce and welcome our moderator for today's conversation, Stephanie Sharp. Stephanie is an associate program officer at the Overdeck Family Foundation, where she is responsible for sourcing and supporting grantee organizations for the Early Impact Portfolio. Prior to joining Overdeck Family Foundation, Stephanie taught pre-K in Baltimore City Public Schools and worked in EdTech, helping to scale platform and content models. So Stephanie, welcome. I'm so excited about our partnership with the Overdeck Family Foundation, and especially excited for today's conversation. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Yoli. We're so excited about this conversation as well. And I'm really thrilled to be together with you all to discuss the state of family engagement today. Like the campaign, Overdeck Family Foundation believes that parents and families are critical to setting young children up for success in school and in life. And our work really centers around the deep belief that families are true assets and cannot be overlooked in our goal to ensure that all children succeed both inside and outside of the classroom, which is really why we as a foundation support family engagement efforts across all age groups and content areas. Research has shown that parents' involvement at home has a greater impact on students' test scores than their education level or their socioeconomic status. We also know that family engagement efforts can increase children's attendance and academic achievement. Given what we're seeing from the early data on COVID learning loss, there is perhaps no more critical time than now to involve families in their children's learning. Luckily, as Yoli mentioned, it feels like we're really at a unique turning point where that wall between school and home has finally been shattered. And schools and districts are beginning to really treat family engagement as a must-have rather than a nice-to-have. That's why I'm really excited for today's conversation with 5 leaders in the family engagement space. We'll use the time together to better understand the innovations and the cross-sector partnerships spurred by the pandemic, what districts and programs are doing to make sure that these high-quality family engagement practices are really here to stay, and how family engagement efforts should factor into these big relief fund spending decisions that are rapidly coming our way. With that, I'm really honored to welcome and introduce today's panel of leaders in this work. Dion Eminata works at Illustrative Mathematics as a lead writer for their K-5 math curriculum and supports implementation of the curriculum at Los Angeles Unified School District. She has focused her career on helping educators use equitable teaching practices to trust all of their students to achieving grade level mathematics. In her work, she collaborates with organizations such as Partnership for LA Schools and Family Engagement Lab to help serve the needs of schools, teachers, families, and students. Adrian Austin is the Acting Deputy Chancellor for Community Empowerment, Partnerships, and Communications at the New York City Department of Education. She leads the DOE's work to empower families and communities while increasing the public's understanding of key policies to deepen support for them. The division that she leads includes the offices of Family and Community Empowerment, Communications, Press, Marketing and Branding, Community Affairs, Intergovernmental Affairs, and Translation and Interpretation Services. This is no small department, and she certainly wears many hats. She previously served as the division's Chief Operating Officer. Alejandro Gibastagak is the founder and CEO of Springboard Collaborative. When Alejandro was 7, his family immigrated to the US, escaping political persecution and seeking educational opportunities. In his upbringing, he learned firsthand that parents' love for their children is the single greatest and most underutilized natural resource in education. After graduating from Harvard in 2009, Alejandro joined Teach for America and spent 2 years as a first grade teacher in Philadelphia. There, he became frustrated that the school system treats low-income parents as liabilities rather than as assets. So he founded Springboard Collaborative in 2011 to close the literacy gap by closing the gap between home and school. Hee-Jae Lim is the founder and CEO of TalkingPoints. Previously, Hee-Jae worked on education reform for public schools in the Middle East and also served as a chief of staff to a special advisor to the Secretary of Education in the UK. As a consultant at McKinsey, she advised the Gates Foundation and Teach First UK. Hee-Jae is also a graduate of Oxford, London School of Economics, and has an MBA from Stanford Business School, where she was an R.J. Miller Scholar, and has been recognized as an Echo and Green Fellow, Stanford Social Innovation Fellow, a Ashoka Changemaker, and Forbes 30 Under 30 to Change Education. And Vidya Sundaram is the co-founder and CEO of Family Engagement Lab, an organization that is catalyzing equitable family engagement in student learning by bridging classroom curriculum and at-home learning. Thank you all for joining us today. I think we can all agree this is truly a rock star panel, and I'm so excited to have you here in this discussion. To kick off our time together, I would really love for us to go around the virtual room, if you will, and have each panelist take 3 minutes to introduce the work that they do. Maybe if you could give us a 30,000-foot view of what parent engagement looked like at your organization last March and how it's changed since then. Adrian, I'd love if we could start with you.
Hi, Steph. Thank you so much for that introduction. I am the Deputy Chancellor for New York City Department of Education. I just want to start by giving some fast facts about New York City DOE. So we are the largest urban pre-K to 12 public school system in the nation. We have over 1 million students. We have over 1 million caregivers. We have over 1,600 schools and over 150,000 employees. So that's just to give you a sense of the scale and the scope of the work that we do. Another statistic that's helpful in thinking through how important what we do in New York City is that 1 in every 300 Americans is a student in a New York City classroom. So just sort of sitting with that. And the work that we have done in the last year to reimagine how we engage parents, I think has been innovative. It's been pretty cutting edge, and I'm very grateful to the teams who have done that. We've had to entirely rethink what parent engagement looks like because most of our work pre-pandemic was in person. So we were used to like going into communities and hosting events, whether it was like a big community forum or bringing the chancellor to speak with a district or speak with a school community. And I just want to, give you an idea of what that looked like. We would go into a school, we would try to find an auditorium of roughly, 300 to 500 seat capacity. And then we would, send out flyers, invite parents from the local community. And if we were able to get, 300 parents together to hear from the chancellor and engage on an educational topic, we would pat ourselves on the back. We would think we did incredibly well. We would have packed the house. And that was pre-pandemic. Post-pandemic, everything that we have done for the most part has been virtual. And so what we've seen from that is just a huge uptick in the number of parents that can participate. And so whereas previously we were bringing out 300, 500 parents at events, we've seen upwards of 90,000 parents attend our virtual events. And so, we are very excited about what that means for our work, and especially how we carry that forward. The other, thing to think about with our work is elections. So every year we hold PA-PTA elections. Again, this is parents going into the school building in a room and like voting. And so all of our parents across the city, our 1,600 schools, had to rethink what that would look like virtually. And in the fall, they did that. So all of our PA-PTAs did virtual elections. We supported them in doing that. We now have a biannual citywide and community education council election. It's going to be the largest, online municipal election probably in the history, period, of the country anywhere. And we already have seen more parents than ever apply to run for a seat. So we broke our record. We had, 1,750 parents plus apply to run for a seat across the city for our education councils. And so just thinking through, we have activated parents in a way that we never have before, whether it's through participation in Google Classrooms and, helping support students in their day-to-day work, or on a larger policy level, getting parents to show up and say what they want, what they like, what they don't like. And so it's an exciting time to be in the work and figuring out how to carry that work forward, especially as we imagine what education is going to look like going forward after this pandemic.
Thanks for sharing that anecdote, Adrian. I think that's like such a powerful visual to move from 300 families to 90,000, and just the sort of activation, as you put it, of the parent community is really transformational. Dion, I'd love to hear from you how family engagement has changed illustrative math's work recently.
Absolutely. I'm really excited to be here and represent mathematics and illustrative mathematics. We are a nonprofit organization, and our curricula, which spans K through 12, are available as open educational resources. So they're free to use. Our mission is to create a world where all learners know, use, and enjoy mathematics. With such an ambitious mission, we want to make sure that students' experiences, where they're from, who they are, all of those things are valued. We want them to be able to see math in the world around them. And to do that, they need to see themselves in the curriculum. Part of that means bringing the mathematical understanding that they have home. And for us, families have always played a big role in our curriculum. So what's unique about our curriculum is it is problem-based, and that means that students learn math by doing math. They make sense of problems and they develop mathematical understanding before formal terms, conventions, and procedures are introduced. And we recognize that may be a different structure from what parents and caregivers have experienced in their schooling. So we provide family support letters for the school year and for each unit that share what students are learning and introduce terms and examples that may not appear in our student workbooks. As an additional support, we provide families with questions that they can ask their child as they go through the unit. At the start of the pandemic last year, we got to work relatively quickly to support families and caregivers. We developed a series called I Am Talking Math, where we pushed out daily math problems through social media and on our website, starting with an image as a hook. We created standards-based math problems for each grade level. This one is from day 11 of the series. If we had more time, I would love to do this with you. We're always looking for ways to do a little math together at IM. But you can see from the question that is posted there on the slide that we always start with an invitation to bring the student into the math conversation and to make it relevant to them. And the next slide shows how we would use the same image, but adjust the question to fit different grade level standards. And this will make it easier for parents with children at different age groups. So everyone can enjoy math together. Another positive result of the pandemic was that we were able to secure resources to build a relationship with Family Engagement Lab and pilot a program to provide an even more comprehensive amount of support to families with FASTalk. And I'm going to let Vidya share what that is that they do.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation from Overdeck Family Foundation, the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Family Engagement Lab is a national nonprofit that catalyzes equitable family engagement by engaging families in a classroom curriculum and bridging that with at-home learning. Today, our tools and services facilitate ongoing communication and collaboration on behalf of more than 30,000 students in the country, nearly 3/4 of whom are socioeconomically disadvantaged. 1/3 are non-native English speakers, and 2/3 identify as a person of color. Because of our use of communication technology, our reach has increased more than 5x since the start of the pandemic. Our signature tool, FASTalk, as Dion mentioned, has demonstrated positive impact on student academic outcomes, particularly for English learners and for students furthest behind their peers. So in the nearly 20 years I've worked in family engagement, I've seen universally families want to know the answers to 3 questions that come up. What is my child supposed to be learning? Is my child on track? And how can I help? And during my career, I've observed that the experiences of families can vary significantly by their race or their culture or language differences with their teachers, to the extent that families of color receive less communication about student learning than affluent white families. This dynamic and this inequity in family engagement harms students of color and their long-term opportunities. Family engagement has always been important, but it is a bigger issue now due to learning loss, and inequality is a choice, and especially focusing on inequality in family engagement is going to help us contribute to improved learning outcomes for students who have been underserved during the pandemic and before. Our tool FASTalk, which stands for Families in Schools Talk, is an equitable family engagement tool that builds the capacity and connections among schools and historically underserved families by sharing engaging at-home activities in each family's home language to reinforce classroom learning. FASTalk is not a typical communication tool because of its focus on equity in school family communication, and also focus on activating the families to focus on learning and the power that they hold to influence their child's learning outcomes. So FASTalk on the next slide is increasing equity in family engagement. FASTalk users are predominantly people of color and qualifying for free and reduced price lunch. And 35% of the families we serve receive materials in a language other than English. So FASTalk is experiencing high user satisfaction and demonstrated academic outcomes. These findings are especially important when combating learning loss, as the impacts of FASTalk are most pronounced for students who are furthest behind grade level. I'll say it another way, the parents are creating this impact with just a small amount of information and can be powerful allies in eradicating learning loss as we have experienced during the pandemic and as we emerge from it. I'll share in the next slide something that we've learned during the pandemic in asking parents and teachers what types of information and text messages would be most helpful for our parents right now. But parents and teachers thought that ways to support a child's reading and writing would be helpful. We're on the same page, but we also observed some major differences in what teachers think parents want and what parents themselves report. So as you can see, parents were far less likely than teachers to say SEL support would be helpful. But another key difference was that more parents responded that tips on how to check whether their child was at grade level or slipping behind would be helpful. And then the largest difference we saw was in support for parental well-being. And that finding suggests that despite the major hurdles that parents are facing and have been facing, that parents still highly value the information and collaboration with teachers to help support children staying on track in school. So these findings also underscore the importance of hearing directly from families as we engage families in supporting students through and beyond the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Vidya, for lifting up particularly just how critical family engagement is to equity in education. I think it's such an important point. I'm noticing some really great questions pop up in the chat box too. So just want to remind all of our attendees to drop those questions into the Q&A box as well. And would love to dig into this more towards the end of our time together. Alejandra, would you walk us through a little bit of how Springboard has approached family engagement and what's changed in the last year?
Happy to, Steph. And thanks, Steph and Yoli, for having me. Thanks to my fellow panelists for engaging in dialogue. And thanks to all the attendees for lending us your time and attention. Parent engagement has always been the beating heart of Springboard's work. And so I can't help myself but to start the story with my family. As Steph mentioned, my parents escaped political persecution. I'm half Chilean, half Puerto Rican. My dad in 1973 in Chile, he had the bright idea to write a play in protest of the dictator Pinochet. He called it Libertad, Libertad. Pinochet was not a fan, so my dad ended up as a political prisoner for a few years in jail and was lucky enough to make it out alive, even luckier to meet my mom. Meanwhile, in Puerto Rico, my mom is the youngest of 13 siblings, the first one in her family to go to college, and one of two kids that won a graduate school scholarship in Paris, where it was that my dad was exiled. So that was the unlikely path that brought both of them there. They fell in love. My sister and I are the proof, I suppose. And my family lived in Puerto Rico for a little while before my parents made the decision to immigrate to the US so that my sister and I could have better educational opportunities. And growing up in a home with no money, but lots of love, it taught me that parents' love for their children is the single greatest and the most underutilized natural resource in education. I brought that perspective with me into the classroom. As Steph mentioned, I was a first grade teacher in Philly, And I was teaching in a Puerto Rican neighborhood where I saw myself and my kids, I saw my parents and their parents. And quickly I realized the connection was deeper than just our shared language and culture and experience of childhood poverty. It was the look. My students' parents look at their kids the same way that my parents look at me, the same way that my sister looks at my nieces, the same way that I'm going to look at my baby when she arrives come July. Eyes that are full of all the love, commitment, and potential that any parent sees in their kid. And yet, I became frustrated that my school and more broadly our system was approaching Black and brown parents like my own as liabilities rather than as assets. I knew we were missing an opportunity. Kids usually spend 75% of their waking hours outside of the classroom. In the COVID era, of course, lots of kids are spending every last waking hour outside of the classroom. And if we don't find a way to help parents and teachers work together in order to give kids access to learning across the continuum of home and school, how are we ever going to close the achievement gap, let alone the opportunity gap? Next slide, please. So I founded Springboard 8 years ago with the vision of closing the literacy gap by closing the gap between home and school. We do that by coaching teachers and parents to team up and help their kids learn to read by 4th grade. We've got a high touch intensive program model. We've got a lighter touch train the trainer model, but both of them leverage the same core methodology, which we've open sourced. We call it Family Educator Learning Accelerators, or FELA for short. They're 5 to 10 week cycles during which parents and teachers team up to help kids reach learning goals. Plain and simple, that's what works about what we do. And they've got these 6 essential steps that can really be applied to any subject area. The first is to build a team. You don't get far if you don't have relational trust. In the before times, we did that through an in-person home visit. Currently, we're doing it through a virtual team building huddle, but it's a moment to establish trust, form a team. Step 2, you measure your baseline. You have to know where a kid is in their learning today in order to be able to set a growth goal in step 3. When you set that goal, we've learned it's gotta be winnable within a 5 to 10 week window. Any shorter than 5 weeks, it's not long enough to produce a lasting habit. Any longer than 10 weeks, and the finish line is so far away that it's just not motivating to families and educators to build a new habit. Step 4, practice, practice, practice. Kids practice with their educators, whether it's a teacher, a tutor, a pre-service teacher, a paraprofessional, whether it's in person or virtual, they need time with their educators. Kids also need to practice with their families at home. And we developed an app that helps parents to guide that daily interaction so that even a parent that isn't themselves a reader can still be a confident teacher of reading. And finally, the whole team has to practice together. The educators and parents need to get together at least 4 times, whether it's an in-person workshop or virtual, in order to share skills and create mutual accountability. Step 5, at the end of it all, you measure progress. You see how kids did relative to their goal, and you celebrate together. Step 6, that's what crystallizes longer lasting habits, both for educators and families. I'll end briefly with 2 quick resources. The next slide, please. Just kidding. So the results, what does this actually do? We took a look at pre and post school closures and compared a treatment group. This is the lightest touch version of what we do, and a control group. And we found that it turns out in places where families and educators were working together to help kids reach learning goals, they got a lot more done than distance learning where families and educators were working in isolation. The treatment group actually had 6 times the amount of reading progress as the control group, which really just tells us that parents and teachers are capable of not just avoiding the COVID slide, but turning it into a really fruitful time for learning. We've also been seeing in our intensive model that even despite all the challenges of the digital divide, we're still getting 90% plus of families to attend a weekly workshop and learn how to be a one-on-one tutor for their child at home. Now, lightning round, the 2 quick resources, felamethod.org, we've open sourced it. We want those 6 steps and resources to be available beyond just the boundaries of our programs. They make good sense for tutoring, summer learning. The very last thing, we also partnered with Cadence Learning. So Springboard's focused on pre-K through 3rd grade. Cadence focuses on 3rd grade and beyond. So we've joined forces in order to help provide K to 8th graders nationally with high quality summer learning this summer.
Cool. Thank you so much, Alejandro, for sharing that. I see some people in the chat saying what a fabulous storyteller you are, and I totally agree. But also, just like the results from the program are so compelling. And I think that the summer learning partnership here is really such an exciting opportunity. I know that there are a handful of people here from districts, and we know that schools are going to be charged with spending money on learning loss recovery solutions and summer school solutions. And I think, this is definitely a compelling partnership to consider. KJ, can you take us home and let us know, tell us about what Talking Points, how Talking Points has functioned in the family engagement space and how your work has changed over the last 12 months?
Of course. Hi, everyone. Great to see all of you here. So I'm the founder and CEO of Talking Points. And Talking Points is an education nonprofit with a mission to unlock the potential of families to fuel their children's learning, especially in under-resourced multilingual communities. And much like Alejandro's story, so I was born in Korea, and when I was 8, my family moved to England. So hence the weird accent that I bring to the table. And I learned English as an English language student, learner student myself. Remember learning the difference between the word forest and tree without actually knowing the concept itself. So remember that very clearly. I grew up in a Korean immigrant community where my mom eventually kind of became the parent leader and the de facto translator and the information sharer. I remember very clearly the parking lot was always crowded around our cars. When she came to pick me up, a lot of Korean parents would surround the car asking all sorts of questions like, when is homework due, or what can I do to support my children's learning? So Talking Points is really grounded in that experience. And we believe that homeschool connection and school family partnerships are so critical to kind of improve student learning and whole child development, and build a multilingual platform that supports teachers and families to communicate with each other in their home languages through two-way translation and capacity supports for educators and families. So if we go to the next slide. So educators, school administrators, and district administrators use a web and mobile app to communicate in English, to send messages to families, which are then translated into their home languages. Families receive the messages in a mobile app or text messages. Tech access has been a huge point of concern in the last year, but all you need is a flip phone, and whatever they communicate in their home language get translated back. Most recently, we launched a video closed captioning feature where teachers can actually record videos of themselves, and then it gets replayed to the families in their home languages. And we also provide kind of scaffolded content for families and teachers to be able to kind of build healthier relationships in a research-based way. So I think, Steph, you asked, how did our approach to family engagement change in the last year? Honestly, feel like we've been banging on the table that family school partnerships are important for the last 6 years, and finally COVID came and it became no longer a luxury and a necessity. So in March last year, we were serving about 500,000 families across the US. And by the end of 2020, we had served more than 3 million families and educators across the country, enabling around 100 million conversations, just less than half of which were not in English. So really excited to be here and happy to share our learnings as well.
Thanks for sharing that, KJ. The scale of the engagement that we're seeing now, I think across all of your work, is just feels really empowering and exciting. Like I said, it's this pivotal moment, and it's great to hear all of these anecdotes. I'm curious, maybe KJ, Vidya, and Alejandro, if you could share a little bit about, just given the disheartening data that we're seeing from the learning loss from school closures. You mentioned that we know that family engagement is so important to student achievement and student learning and engagement. Can you share just a little bit more about what you're seeing that proves that theory out? Maybe we can start with KJ.
Yeah, I can get us started. I mean, first of all, Steph, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but it's so, my personal experience growing up, it was so loud and clearly born out of academic research. So ample research to show that homeschool connections play a critical role in supporting student learning across all grade levels. Some literature suggests that it's twice as effective in predicting a student success than how richer families or their socioeconomic status. And intuitively, it makes sense because children spend 85% of their time outside school and at home or in differing environments. And in COVID, that was actually 100%. So intuitively makes sense. And not only that, I think there's also literature to show that increased family involvement has an impact of increasing per student spending by $1,000 a year. So if you think about the potential ROI of kind of the impact of homeschool connections on student learning, it's $1,000 a year per student. That's 10% of budget in states like California, where Talking Points is based. So that's kind of borne out by academic research. And then it's also supported by the data we have. So for example, 96% of educators reported increases in student attendance, engagement, and improvements in student behavior. 90% of parents said that they can actually support students in a better way by informing teachers to adjust their own teaching needs. And what I'm most excited to share is that Syracuse City Public Schools, so one of our district partners, recently reported a 20% increase in ELL graduation rates. And they reported and kind of pointed to increased family involvement as the single most contributing factor to a 20% increase, which I think is quite remarkable. And it's borne out by real world data here as well.
That's amazing. Congrats to Syracuse. That's a huge win and such a testament to the power of family engagement. Vidya, I know you wanted to share a little bit too around the work that FASTalk is doing to support early identification.
Yeah, so we have been engaged with a number of different partnerships around, aligning the types of information being shared between parents and teachers to really equip parents with the information that allows them to better observe and assess what their children are, maybe exhibiting at home. And especially, with distance learning, it's very difficult, I think, for people, like, especially, what might be in the realm of what an early childhood educator might be responsible for. Like, how do you suddenly transition that now into a new context? So the parent has always been in that context. The parent's always observing their child. And so it's so important, both, now when there is the distance learning context is still there for so many families, and also thinking of the future, how can educators and families who've traditionally relied on in-person meetings to create new models of collaboration, while also building the capacity of parents to support their child's development in early childhood and in the home context. And so it's so important to help families assess whether their child is meeting key developmental milestones so that they can receive the important and appropriate early intervention when needed. And this is a concept that I think you can extend to any type of setting, whether it's a child meeting grade level expectations, whether they're developmentally reaching the stages of social and emotional skill development. There are many different domains that you can think about this in, and bridging the parent-teacher collaboration in ways that are building the capacity of parents, but also increasing and improving the communication between parents and teachers. So the pilot we developed with the Louisiana Department of Education this year focuses on parents supporting milestone development across social emotional learning, language and communication, cognitive development, and movement and physical activity, and helping parents identify when their child is not meeting those developmental milestones and being able to spot those signs, whether the child needs additional support, and finding resources that they're qualified for, and connecting directly with the teacher in school. So using technology and equipping parents with information can be incredibly powerful. And it's just that it's so important to recognize that parents, are the eyes and ears now of child development and skill development across grades. And it's important to be investing in those areas and improve the capacity building, both around communication and around knowledge and skills for the parents.
Totally, could not agree more. Early ID, early intervention, or we just know there's such impactful levers for achievement and success. And families are bought in, as Alejandro said earlier, like they are one of the greatest untapped natural resources that we have here to do this work. Alejandro, I know you wanted to share too about the ROI here on family engagement.
Yeah, all I would add is that I think what we're seeing is that families are more engaged, not less, despite all of the challenges and overwhelm that they're disproportionately carrying the burden of the pandemic. And the proof is in the pudding. With our intensive program model, we're still seeing 90% plus of families attend a weekly workshop to learn how to be that one-on-one reading tutor for their child at home, despite kind of all of the barriers of the digital divide. And what matters isn't the turnout, it's how that turnout translates into action and instructional time at home. For every hour that a teacher leads a family workshop, parents deliver 25 hours of tutoring at home. If we tried to replicate that in the classroom setting, it would be cost prohibitive. But families are willing and able to teach for free because they love their kid. And they've actually increased the amount of one-on-one support that they're offering, that they're providing with their children at home. Pre-pandemic, we were seeing families average about 22 minutes a night of coaching their kids in reading. Amidst the pandemic, we're seeing families coaching their kids in reading for 26 minutes per day. That's averaged over 7 days per week. And not only that, but they're also setting an expectation their kids are reading another 20 minutes per day independently at home, day after day, 7 days a week. There's lots of research that shows that 15 minutes seems to be the magic number of at-home reading, beyond which kids sustain their gains in reading. So to have families have such a multiple on that amount of reading is super exciting. And importantly, it's a persistent habit. So even 6 months after one of these relatively short 5 to 10 week goal setting cycles is over, parents are still coaching their kids in reading every bit as much, every bit as often.
So we know family engagement. It sounds like we're pretty bought into that this works. That this is not a new concept. There's research. There's programmatic evidence. There's data. We've experienced it firsthand. Many of us. It works. What were some of the traditional barriers that made good family engagement so difficult then? And what factors over the past year allowed for innovation and scale to occur? I'm going to call it so quickly. I mean, it was 12 months and we're talking about reaching 90,000 parents at NYC DOE and 3 million families through TalkingPoints. This happens quickly. I'd love to hear from Alejandro, Hije, Adrian, Dion. I'd love to hear what changed. What were those barriers and what moved them? Alejandro, maybe you want to start?
Sure. I think a reflection that I'll share is that there's a mental model. You can call it a bias within our education system that I think the pandemic has started to loosen. And what I'm talking about is that for lots of deep-seated reasons that are another conversation for another day, the education sector tends to look at Black and brown parents and they don't see a teacher. They don't see the asset that family truly is. And it's hard. You don't train your way out of that. It takes experiences to the contrary, where educators and families are working together and experiencing success. That's what it takes to flip the mental model and for educators to fundamentally shift the way that they view families, which is a precursor to being able to shift the relationship that they have with families. I think that COVID's disrupted that mental model, if only for a moment that I hope isn't fleeting, which creates just an urgent and singular opportunity for our field as a whole to build a new mental model, one in which educators and see parents as co-teachers and as teammates. In a lot of ways, I think COVID's been a forcing function that makes us all realize that when it comes to educating kids, there's no going around parents. You have to work with them, you have to work through them in order to ensure that kids have access to learning across the continuum of home and school. That's always been true. COVID just made it painfully apparent. But therein lies the opportunity, right? That's the silver lining that we can find hope in, that we've got that kind of once in a lifetime opportunity to rebuild so that family engagement becomes the new normal, so that educators and families are working together rather than in isolation, and so that school systems become more equitable places that value Black and brown parents as experts and invest in them as partners.
Totally. Adrian, I see you nodding. Is this like resonating with what you've been experiencing at NYC DOE?
Totally. I was listening to Alejandro and saying, like, that's exactly right. There's had to be a culture and mind shift, at least in New York City DOE. I know we have talked about family engagement. Our former chancellor, Chancellor Richard Carranza, really transitioned us from engagement, because engagement is just like bringing folks to the table, to empowerment. Like, we want parents not only to show up, but we want them to show up and ask us the questions and hold us accountable in some sense. And so there's been this subtle sort of sea change in messaging and how we refer to our communities and how we refer to families. And I think the pandemic and switching to a whole new paradigm of teaching has helped to move it along and accelerate the pace. And so whereby you could say, well, you know, we don't think the parents have the capacity, or nobody had the capacity. And so, you know, to understand Google Classrooms, to understand Google Meets, to really understand all of the digital tools that were necessary to make this transition, everyone from parents to teachers had to have a round of education. And so I think that equalizing place, and then the importance of parents, look, if you have a kid that's like, I have an 8-year-old, my 8-year-old can't log into Google Classroom unless I'm there as the parent sort of assisting, especially in the beginning, recognizing that parents just have to play a role. Otherwise, the students can't log in, they can't participate, they can't engage. And so that whole reality, I think, has really accelerated the pace of parent engagement and parent empowerment. And then the other piece is we had a lot of barriers. So I think about our PA, PTA meetings and our, you know, professional learning opportunities for parents, all of these things, they'd happen during times where parents are commuting to and from work. They can't attend in person. They have childcare. They got a few kids. They're like, I have to, you know, have childcare. I can't arrange for a babysitter. And we didn't really have, we had not embraced technology in the way that we have now. And there weren't real ways for us to deliver opportunities for parents to participate virtually. And so, you know, again, the pandemic has forced us all to learn. You know, I can't say that I knew Zoom and all of these different platforms before the pandemic. We all know them now. We know how to create the meetings. We know how to run the meetings. And then by virtue of that, parents have been able to participate that were previously locked out. And that's not to say that there's not a digital divide, because there is still a digital divide. And there are a lot of parents that I think we have to work harder to reach and really bring into those spaces. And I think in-person and some blend of in-person and digital tools will be hopefully the direction that we go. But we have, I think, gone a long way to starting to really break down some of the barriers.
Yeah, I so appreciate you saying that. And I've noticed too that in the chat, this question of like how the digital divide is impacting this work, knowing that technology is such a critical lever right now for reaching families. You mentioned earlier that for talking points, like you just need a text message. It's just a simple phone. I'd love to hear a little bit more around what you're hearing from the schools that you're working with, and how technology has really sort of accelerated family engagement, how they're using it to reach families.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, first of all, acknowledging that digital divide still remains to be a huge issue in a lot of the school systems that we serve. And although a lot of those school systems have made incredible headway because everyone's been kind of forced to, the way that Talking Points has supported school districts in the last year, I have to caveat, is more than what we call in service of student learning. So a lot of the school systems that we have seen, the connections to families are important for student well-being in general and the family's well-being. So the way that Talking Points has supported sending and receiving of text messages in their own languages has covered what we call basic human services, from all the way to free meal access, because immediately when COVID hit, school districts weren't necessarily worried about how to get students on Zoom, but they were more worried about what if our students who are receiving free reduced lunch starve, because once you don't have the Maslow's hierarchy locked down, student learning cannot happen. So that's been kind of a learning in the last year for us. We've also seen teachers and school systems send text messages out in terms of instructional materials, so that it goes vis-a-vis the parents, especially for early elementary grades. in absence of access to Zoom or devices or Wi-Fi and so on. So it has really democratized the access to information for under-resourced multilingual families in our communities. And I think just going back to kind of the silver lining of all of this that Adrian and Alejandro started on, every parent has had to become a teacher in one sense or another in the last year. And every educator who have had kids have also been a parent. So that kind of incredible sense of empathy being built, I do think is kind of smashing the barriers, traditional barriers to family engagement. But of course, technological barriers is remaining as an issue and something that we still need to work on as well.
Yeah, it is. The barriers are challenging, and I don't think we don't have a silver bullet of that everything is fixed and solved for sure. But I think that there's just been so much momentum around this. Thanks to the work that you all are doing. Dion, I'd love to hear from your perspective, from the curriculum side, sort of how things have, what has allowed for this innovation and scale to happen so quickly.
Yeah. Well, speaking on the technology divide, in Louisiana, we had been working on a video project with our middle school courses in Algebra 1. So at the start of the pandemic, they were able to broadcast some of those videos on PBS, which supported distance learning, especially for families without internet access. Also, our K-3 lessons were used to broadcast the series on PBS in Massachusetts. But speaking on another real barrier to positive family engagement, especially in math, what we call that math phobia or math anxiety, and I'm talking about in adults, right? And so sometimes there's a reluctance to engage in math, and with good reason. Much of our experiences with math growing up was rote memorization and learning steps and procedures without really understanding why we are doing these steps or how to connect these mathematical ideas to the world around us, outside of like trains passing in the night or whatever the word problems were at that time, right? And so now that students are being asked to share their mathematical thinking, this requires a level of number sense and flexible thinking that doesn't match our rigid experiences with math. And this can be daunting for parents and families. And so what I love about partnering with Family Engagement Lab and the FASTalk program is that not only we typically as parents, we get the homeschool communication that is about filling out forms or signing off on report cards or something like that, or sending in money for some kind of fundraiser. But this is different. FASTalk not only supports parents with a fun way to engage and connect students with what they're doing in the classroom, but it's also in their home language, which is extremely important. It shows that we value family connection just as much as we value the ability for students to see mathematics in their world, even at home.
I'm so glad you brought up the FASTalk partnership, and I'm curious too, like curricula providers have not historically been a part of this family engagement discussion. To your point, like the work that you're doing with FASTalk is different. I think, we all are probably more familiar with those filling out forms type of communications and fundraisers. Why did Illustrative Math decide to make family engagement a part of its curriculum? And do you see other curriculum providers moving in this direction?
Well, one thing that I was a part of the K-5 writing team, leading the work of grades 2 through 5. And one of the things that we had been grappling with was how to design a curriculum that supports teachers implementing culturally relevant and responsive teaching practices. A major component of that is understanding student culture, specifically how students best process information. So traditionally, we all learned through this lecture style, or what we call direct instruction, where the teacher told us how to do a problem, we followed those steps, and students who could follow those steps independently were the most successful. However, students' way of meaning making can differ based on cultural or racial background. So for many Black and Brown children, that traditional way of learning is too individualistic, and it would be more natural for them to process information collectively. So lesson structures that provide more opportunities for student-to-student collaboration and inquiry become increasingly important in including all students in the math lesson. So we as educators must value what students are bringing to the classroom, and that includes valuing their way of making sense of the world. And that's why families are such an important part of student learning. The mathematical experience shouldn't stop when the math lesson is over, right? Mathematical contexts are happening all the time throughout the day. And if a student has a mathematical idea or a question at home, they should be empowered to explore it. And likewise, if a student is at school and finds a way to connect with their learning in the classroom to their lived experiences at home, we should empower them equally to do that as well. So to support that, as a curriculum writing team, we included tasks that represent non-white and ethnically diverse cultures, which helps to remove a barrier for marginalized students who are always, or for the most part, in the position of having to learn the context of a word problem in addition to learning the math concepts. So trying to remove that barrier. We also wanted to support students engaging in unfamiliar contexts. So in the teacher's guide, we wrote in suggestions to the teachers to support, say, a launch into an activity. Teachers can display images, videos, or simply ask questions like the one for our drums context that we saw earlier. This gives students an opportunity to take a moment, pause, and make a connection to the math, and allows them to bring their whole selves into the math lesson. And we can't do that without a profound respect for and understanding of our students' family lives. I do believe that other national curricula will move in the direction of creating tasks that are culturally relevant for students. But I believe that at Illustrative Mathematics, we are doing something revolutionary here. I haven't seen yet other national curricula give the level of attention to culturally responsive pedagogy that we have given, especially in mathematics. So it's a really exciting time to do great work for our students and families.
You guys are really leading the charge, and I appreciate that you are revolutionary, and I hope you're not revolutionary for that long. I do hope that other national curricula providers join the movement because it is so powerful. Vidya, I'd love to hear from you. Just I know that FASTalk does do curriculum alignment work with multiple partners. How do you approach that?
Yes, we do work with other providers. I think notably, so Louisiana Department of Education on ELA guidebooks was our first partnership in ELA. Illustrative Mathematics is our first partnership in math and supporting math curriculum, and specifically, for the reasons that Dion so wonderfully outlined, the focus on cultural responsiveness in the curriculum itself, and an interest in really translating those materials that are engaging the students' whole lived experience in the classroom, but inviting parents into that experience as well, so that there can be a coordinated and collaborative support across parents and teachers. And so, with parents having much more visibility into the classroom than before, like with technology and with remote learning, we really have to, I think, just to echo that sentiment that this work shouldn't be revolutionary for long, because we have to move into a space where parents are recognized as, I think, the CPRL team at Columbia has such a wonderful description of the instructional core. Like families and parents being a part of that instructional core is a very important way to think about instruction moving forward, and curriculum as a component of that. to just share, I'd love to share like an example of like what we're doing with illustrative math. So like for all the teachers out there who, or former educators in the audience who like talking about fractions is like the big joke, or, you know, it's always like a chuckle moment when you want to talk about the most difficult thing to teach in the classroom. Our pilot with illustrative math, the K-5 curriculum is started with fractions basically, and so the example, like how do you make fractions as a concept really accessible to parents, especially as kids are learning it. And I have an elementary school age daughter, and I literally was watching my husband try to explain fractions to her 2 days ago, so this is all like very present in my life. But the example activity is let your child be the teacher this week. How can we show fraction on a number line? Can you, and then prompting the parent to ask their child, can you show me how to make one that shows 0, 1/3, 2/3, and 1? And so that would be like just a quick prompt to a parent to have a conversation with their child. These are also translated into multiple languages and adapted for families and come directly from their child's teacher. So parents know exactly what their child's learning, how they can help, and also gives them a sense of whether their child is actually learning it. Like, you know, in the child teaching that back to the parent, they can learn so much about whether their child's really grasped the material. And so one of our early insights from this project is that parents have been talking with their teachers about the messages, having those conversations, and we're just really excited to, you know, to continue our good work with the illustrative mathematics team to bring these concepts to life so that the child can feel supported in multiple settings.
It really does bring it to life. And thank you for that example. It's just such a great concrete way to understand the work and how you're bringing fractions home for families in fun ways. If we could pivot a little bit, I love the questions that are coming in the Q&A. So I definitely want to make sure that we have time to get to those and encourage everyone to continue to drop questions in that bucket for all of our panelists. But maybe one last question for me. I'd love to talk about the money. So districts and states are about to receive over $122 billion of relief funding. And of these new funds, we know that SEAs are required to reserve at least 5%, LEAs are reserving 20% to address learning loss. So I would love to hear from all of you how you think family engagement should factor into these spending decisions. If you do, maybe your answer is you don't think they should, but I doubt it. And so would love to just hear your thoughts on that. And maybe if we can start, with Alejandro.
Sure. Short answer, yes. I think family engagement is the most cost-effective, meaningful, and equitable way to close the opportunity gap broadly, but to address COVID learning loss specifically. And I think it's important that it not be siloed. Sometimes in our sector, we have a tendency to put family engagement over here and teaching and learning over there. And they're at opposite ends of the hallway. And with family engagement, we tend to think about it as a general ethos or a value, whereas teaching and learning is a concrete set of practices. We've got to bridge those two worlds together, and this is our chance to do so. And what I mean specifically is that teachers and families, they have a goal in common. They both want kids to be successful learners, and they need each other to realize that goal. Neither of them can do that entirely on their own. Teachers are the experts on instruction. They've gained strategies to help kids make progress in their learning, but the classroom isn't structured in a way that makes it easy to individually support every child. That's why they need families. Parents are the experts on their own kids. Nobody knows a kid better than they do. Nobody loves a kid more than they do. And they're the only people that have access to one-on-one time with their children. There's just no smaller classroom than a family's living room. And there's no better way to personalize instruction than through a parent. Can you imagine anything more personal than a family and their kid sharing a book at bedtime? So for me, those are the complementary skill sets that form the basis for a sustainable partnership in which teachers share instructional strategies with families in exchange for the commitment that families will practice those strategies at home and share their expertise and knowledge back with the teacher. So yes, family engagement should be an investment that every district is making to address COVID learning loss. Families are willing and able to teach for free, as I mentioned, for the love of the game. You're not going to find a more cost-effective, meaningful, or equitable way to give kids access to high-quality instruction or high-quality tutoring.
Cool. Yeah, I totally agree. Vidya, what would your recommendation here be?
Well, definitely. I mean, I think the thing that a lot of, research, like you're seeing lots of surveys come out. National PTA just had a survey come out about how parents are so invested in helping their children recover from learning loss that it would be just such a missed opportunity for schools and districts to not recognize that, I think everything Alejandra said about just the siloed responsibilities and thinking like, oh, okay, I got my part. No, we really have to think collaboratively about investing in innovative partnerships between school systems and families and communities overall to support students. We really do have to take this crisis of learning loss very seriously. The implications are too severe for families, for students, and for our communities overall. And so, and we all of our organizations here are living and demonstrating proof that when you do make those investments in collaboration between schools and families, it helps students. So there's no reason any district should not be making these, and again, cost-effective investments in solutions that are accessible for families, that are equitable, and that are really putting the needs of our most underserved students first when thinking of solutions to improve equitable outcomes and address learning loss for those that are most affected by it.
So I'm happy to jump in here because I know in New York City DOE, we're very excited about the prospect of stimulus funding. I think I'm sure this is a story across the country with school districts, but we've been cut multiple times over the last, couple of years. And so what that's meant is that we haven't been able to do the kind of robust investment in partnerships with some of these new digital resources and companies that we would like to do. And so I can give you a couple of sort of concrete examples. One of the things we were really excited to bring on board in last November was Parent University. So we have this wonderful online tool where we have now over 300 courses. They're free to parents. Parents just come in, they log in, and they can, access a range of different courses. But where we would like to go is to have partnerships with a lot of, and I'm hoping I can have follow-up conversations with my fellow panelists. But we would like to be able to add more content so that tool becomes a place kind of like Pinterest or YouTube, or where parents can look up a topic and they can easily pull down a course. And what that requires is an investment and partnerships for DOE to be able to bring in that kind of content that hits not only the families that we normally hit, but also, make sure that we have content in languages other than English for our families. And then just thinking through, even for our schools, this is sort of a burgeoning area. And so having a suite of tools, like parent engagement tools that would be available to principals so that they could use a digital tool that would help with translation and all of these things, which are incredibly difficult for principals while they're figuring out how to accommodate students and make sure safety and health protocols are followed. But to be able to give them sort of a package and say, here are some resources that are really great, they're culturally responsive, they're going to help you plug in and communicate with families. We'd love to be able to do that, and of course that would require funding. So we're excited at the idea of being able to bring that work. We certainly think it's important and could be very good for our students and for our families.
That's great. TJ, any thoughts that you would add here?
I think +1 to many of the things that Adrian, Vidya, and Alejandra said. And I think what's really important to kind of know around the stimulus is majority of the funding is specifically targeted at under-resourced, diverse, minority students. And the impact of homeschool connections, family engagement has on those under-resourced kind of students who are who are experiencing more significant learning loss than others, it's actually even greater. So if you think about your investment from an ROI perspective, you get greater returns for these students who are falling behind, and family engagement can be done in a cost-effective way. So I think in terms of when you're thinking about return on investment, specifically on Title I students combating learning loss, this is just a no-brainer for me in terms of efficiency, effectiveness. This is the moment we have this unique opportunity to bring families and schools together. And by the way, some districts are, getting 70% increase on their district budgets. This is kind of, it feels like a one-time opportunity, and a one-time opportunity to prove out that family engagement does improve student learning. And guess what, for underserved students. So
it's truly an exciting opportunity. So I would love to move us all to Q&A, just acknowledging how rich it is, and really want to thank our panelists so far for sharing these wonderful insights, but also our participants for really just engaging so deeply in the conversation. I think one question that is sort of surfacing across multiple participants' thinking and responses has really been around this theme of how do we show a measurable difference in the investments for family engagement, which I think is a question that maybe all of us can tackle.
I can jump in. I think what I'd say is in the spirit of breaking down the silos, like the way to show a measurable difference is to measure the change in student learning. And that's kind of the proof point that begins to chip away at the mental model that prevents us from making more progress. What we've learned is that there's power in short goal setting cycles. There's power in incremental goals. When we ask families in focus groups of everything they had access to during Springboard programming, what most helped them to support their child's learning at home, far and away what they say is it's setting and achieving a goal with my kid. And especially for folks that are having that experience for the first time, it can be a transformative one. If you put the goalpost so far away, it just doesn't have the same motivating power to be able to try something new and kind of jump in the deep end. So there's something about that 5 to 10 week window of the incremental goal that encourages families and educators to take the leap of faith and try it together. And during that period, you can demonstrate significant growth on the part of the learner. And in doing so, for teachers, the light bulb goes off. Families are the co-teachers I never even realized that I had. And you don't put that back in the box. Educators want to keep working with families once they have that tangible quick win of seeing kids advance in their learning, and parents similarly. That experience of setting and achieving a goal with their kid is one that they want to revisit over and over again. And those small wins ultimately lead to the big wins. But if you only ever focus on the big win, it can be too daunting to take the next step.
Maybe Alejandro, while you're talking about FELAs, there were quite a few questions, FELAs, there were quite a few questions on like just sort of what is required from teachers and parents to implement this, how much input is there? I definitely encourage participants to follow up with Alejandro afterwards on these things, but if you could, Alejandro, just tell us a little bit quickly around like what sort of intensity level is required to go into it, that would be helpful.
Yeah, briefly, I think that the idea is that it's more like interval training than marathon running. So a school community doing FELAs, our recommendation is to do them 3 times over the course of a year. A 5-week cycle during the summer to prevent regression and replace it with a learning gain. A 10-week cycle in the fall, once teachers have identified, they've gotten to know their classroom, they've identified who are the kids that I really want to provide some more intensive support to in order to give them a boost. So that 10-week cycle would happen sometime in October, November. And then another 10-week cycle in the spring as a big push, a sprint through the finish with another group of kids that where you really want to meaningfully partner with their families and accelerate their progress. It can look a zillion different ways. We kind of played the game of Jenga to remove cost and complexity from the model and try to distill what's the method that drives impact within the program so that we can open source that method and it can grow far beyond the boundaries of programming. So really the only must-haves are those 6 steps. You need to have a relational touch point at the outset. It can be as simple as a 30-minute call or conversation to form a team and build some trust. You need to measure a baseline because without it, you can't set a growth goal. And the goal is like, it's the keystone that holds all the other pieces together. You need to do a lot of practice, the kids with their educator, the kids with their family, and the team's got to practice together. Otherwise, you're not a team. And then at the end, you need to measure the progress that you've made. How'd you do relative to your goal? If you're invested in the goal at the outset, you want to know. And then finally, you can't skip the celebration because that's what produces the longer lasting habit. That's it. As long as you're doing the 6 things in sequence, parent-teacher collaboration doesn't have to be more complicated. And we use that method with respect to literacy. That is Springboard's mission. But you can use it. It makes good sense for middle school math or high school science. The president of our organization, Aubrey, used a FELA to help her son improve his game in basketball. Like, they literally got together with the coach. They measured how many layups he could make in a minute. They set a goal 5 weeks down the road. She would practice with her kid at home. Her kid would practice with the coach, and then her and the coach would kind of huddle up at games every week or every other week to get on the same page together. At the end of it all, they saw how many layups you could make in a minute, and they got pizza together. Like it's goal setting, plain and simple, and you can apply it to any context.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that. Switching gears a little bit away from FELA, there's a great question in here, Adrian, for you from John Prescott. With the online shift and increase from 300 to 90,000, what unique opportunities and challenges did that present? And what did the feedback loop look like for maintaining engagement?
Yeah, great question. So the opportunities, I guess, like taking a 30,000 foot view, we have 2 ways of communicating with parents. One is we have direct communication, which is this, being able to directly speak to 90,000 parents at one time is an amazing opportunity to directly get information out. The other way that we get information out is through the press office, like all of our local news stations, where they're filtering, and then also providing a little bit of an editorial on whatever it is that we're doing or saying. We meet regularly with elected officials who also we hope to be ambassadors for what's happening with their constituents. And then we have really great relationships with community-based organizations. So you can think of like 100 Black Men and NAACP, you go through the list of all the really great grassroots organizations that have bases of parents that they're speaking to on a regular basis. And we touch base with them and make sure they have current information, because what has been a tremendous challenge during a pandemic where we can't count on parents coming in and backpacking letters and all that stuff is getting information just straight out to parents. And so the advantage of having so many people join in is the ability to like unfiltered, get out our message, whatever it is, to parents. The challenge of that is how do you make it an interactive space with 90,000 people? And so, we're starting to try to experiment with some ideas around that. So we're looking at like, Mentimeter or some of the other tools of like, maybe we can do a poll through Zoom. We're starting to play around a little bit more now that we're a little bit more comfortable, because it's very high stakes for any school district to do an event that has 90,000 people. What you don't want is for it to crash. Or for something to go entirely wrong, because then, you get in trouble and you're embarrassed and all the rest of that. And we've been fortunate that we haven't had that happen. But those are some of the challenges, obstacles, and then opportunities with that. And then just how you do follow-up. One of the things that we've done, one of the opportunities that this has presented to us is, we send out a regular newsletter to parents, just giving like a heads up, but here's what's happening within the DOE. And so we've started to incorporate, the parents who are signing up and, do you want to opt into our newsletter? That's one opportunity that has flowed from that. And then just also making sure that where we're having future events, now we have a list, a robust distribution list that we can, make parents aware of what's happening and what events are occurring.
Cool. You mentioned poll, so I think we might also be using a poll soon. Feels like it was a good nudge. So I think CGLR, Sierra might be sharing a poll soon. There it is. And we really encourage you all to participate and let us know how today went. There was one question here as well, I think from David Copperwood. If you all know any research about how these strategies for family engagement have reduced subgroup chronic absenteeism rates.
I'm happy to send some through separately. I think I kind of put my email in there. I think anecdotally, I mean, I think one of the things to recognize over the last year has been if you can't get to parents, then a lot of the kids haven't been able to go online, full stop. So it's as simple as that. So connecting with parents to make sure that kids are attending online classes or able to go through the technical challenges has been a huge learning for us. And I think just going back to the question around measurable gains around family engagement, I think we can broaden the scope of what student learning means, because if the students don't feel safe or they're in an environment that feels socially emotionally stable, then learning just doesn't happen. And that's kind of the foundational basis. And family connections have been incredibly important to keep the students from kind of mentally healthy over the last year. So we've had stories where talking points through educators connecting with students have prevented suicide. And I know that's a grim picture that I'm painting here, but that is just the reality and the role that family school connections have had in just stabilizing the year that we've had, I think is also one that we don't want to overlook in addition to student learning.
So maybe in the last few minutes that we have together, there's sort of another theme that's bubbling up across everyone's contributions to the Q&A channel. How do we maintain this mindset post the pandemic? How do we keep the momentum going?
I'm happy to start. I think it's so important for the core kind of functions of school systems leaders, anyone responsible for education of students, to recognize that family engagement is part of their responsibility as well, and that it's a shared responsibility across the system. And I think once the role of families is recognized as a core function of our school systems, that's critical to sustaining this focus on family engagement in the future.
I'll just chime in and say, you know, from my perspective, I'm like, my greatest mantra, the thing that I am most proud about is our work around parent empowerment, because the greatest advocates for this work are the parents. And so we've tried to really make a point of empowering our parents, getting our parent leaders who are in spaces, the PA, PTA, they're consulting with principals as a part of school leadership teams, they're representatives in districts, and they're leading district conversations on education. And they are, you know, I mean, in New York anyway, you know, you look at the top lobbyists for education and you'll see some parents on there. And so I think, you know, both from a leadership position within DOE, making sure that the leadership is consistent and committed to parent empowerment, parent engagement, and incorporating parents, but also, you know, making sure that our parents are also, you know, using their voices to be advocates for their role in this work, because there's so many of them. You know, there's more parents than there are, you know, folks with the educator hat on, and I think they've often been the most effective allies for school districts. And so, you know, making sure they're on the same page and then amplifying their voices and supporting them.
I can speak from kind of a call for action from the school system side. I think, you know, silver lining is that family engagement has become an experiential good. A lot of educators have now realized engaging families to support their learning to an extent that they could have never imagined before. So from a school system leadership perspective, just thinking about families not as a separate vertical to the school operations and teaching, but as a very integrated part of planning, priorities, and initiatives in combating learning loss. I think that mental model shift is critical to sustaining this down the line as well.
I can briefly add, I think you're right, Steph, that we're kind of at this crossroads. The way I see it, this can play out in one of two ways. Either distance learning remains kind of a frustrating experience, eroding our education sector's faith in the promise of learning at home. An entire generation of Black and brown kids falls through the cracks, and their parents are relegated back to the margins of the school system once the buildings begin to reopen. And I worry that with an influx of resources, there might be a temptation to kind of reach for the familiar set of classroom interventions that for decades have failed to move the needle. Or we can choose a different path, right? Where districts experience success working with families. Teachers and parents, they set goals together. They support each other as teammates, and they notch wins. They begin seeing the fruits of their labor in kids reaching one goal and then the next and the next and the next. Families and educators, they will build relationships and habits that persist long after the pandemic is a distant memory. And districts will dramatically improve their outcomes by increasing instructional time at home with the people and the resources that have been there all along. And finally, schools will become more equitable places where families and educators work together as equals. That's our choice. And I think collectively, not just the panel, but the people who are here attending from all over the country, we've got the ability to go down that second path.
I think maybe we might have time to squeeze in a few more questions. So I'm gonna try to do it pretty quickly. I see this great question from Catalina Semperhorak, and my apologies if I'm pronouncing anyone's name completely incorrectly. But are any of the panelists involved in conversations at the state level to encourage governors and state board of eds to make specific suggestions about parent engagement to the local districts?
At Talking Points, we are in conversations with some level, depending on the states, but to be able to influence both kind of the CARES Act last year, as well as the stimulus spending, and requiring some of that spending to go towards parent-teacher communication, equitable access to information, and so on. Would love to get more introductions or connections that you might have to be able to do that with more states. But we know that states like California, New York, Texas have specific provisions around information sharing and getting access to all families in the way that reaches them as well. So pretty excited about state level influence and policy implications.
I'll join Hijay in excitement. I think one of the advantages that SEAs have as opposed to LEAs is that they don't have to reopen buildings of their own. So we've seen they're sooner able to focus their attention on COVID learning loss than schools that are still working out the logistics of safely reopening their buildings. On Springboard side, we've been able to establish a partnership with the Massachusetts Department of Education, a little over a $3 million partnership over 2 years to launch a statewide tutoring initiative with families at the core. Similar conversations happening in Connecticut, early conversations happening in Colorado. But TJ's right, credible introductions are the name of the game. If you weren't already in dialogue before the pandemic, it's real hard to start a new conversation. So to the extent that folks that are a part of the webinar have states and are connected with state leaders that are eager to address COVID learning loss and do so by leveraging families as assets, those are conversations that any of the panelists would be eager to have, and they couldn't be more timely.
Yeah, just echoing that, I've highlighted work we've done with Louisiana Department of Education a couple of times this call. We work at a state level in a couple of different capacities. One is connecting and drawing a through line around special education initiatives, English learner initiatives, curriculum adoption, through to parents, and also creating and supportive frameworks and implementation models that are statewide that can help support and sustain effective family engagement practices, across pre-K and then all the way up into middle and high school. So really excited to have further conversations with folks who are interested about that work.
Terrific. Well, I know we're coming up on time. I can't thank all of you enough for such a rich and wonderful discussion. I think it was just really enlightening to hear from your experiences. And I just feel so excited about where family engagement is going overall. Yoli, thank you so much also for hosting us, and I'll pass it over to you to round us out.
Great. Well, thank you. What an incredibly rich conversation. And I feel hopeful because of you all. You've been leading this work on family engagement. You have been educating all of us about the science and the research, the solidness behind why it matters for us to engage parents as partners, as essential partners in their work. So thank you for this conversation. There was an incredible amount of engagement in the chat and the Q&A. Almost 200 people are still on the webinar, so that should tell you how much people appreciate what you had to bring. So thank you on behalf of the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you, Stephanie, for moderating, for being a partner through the Overdeck Family Foundation in this work. And thank you to each of you, Adrian in New York City, EJ, Lim at Talking Points, Alejandro at Springboard. Thank you to Dion, and who am I missing? I think that's everyone. We're just Vidya, there you are. Vidya from FASTalk. So we are grateful for the opportunity to have you share your insights and your wisdom with our network. With that, I'm just going to ask Sierra to pull up that last slide as we, again, share with you the upcoming webinars. I won't read them all because there's several coming up in April, one on the 6th, 2 on the 13th, 2 on the 20th. We've run through all of them at the beginning of the hour, and we posted the link so that you could register for any of these. We will continue our learning conversations every Tuesday, and we'll hope you'll come back and join us. Again, thank you all. Have a great day.